I stared at Steven across the dinner table, my frustration building as he typed away on his laptop. I just told him about Lisa's Halloween party invitation, hoping for some reaction. Anything really, but all I got was a distracted mumble. "Just be careful," he said, not even bothering to look up. I felt a lump form in my throat. When was the last time he'd actually looked at me? Really seen me? I couldn't remember. The walls of our beautiful new house suddenly felt suffocating. I pushed my plate away, appetite gone. "I'm going to get ready for bed," I announced. Not that it mattered. Steven just grunted in response. As I climbed the stairs, I thought about Lisa's invitation, a Halloween party. A chance to be someone else for a night, to feel alive again. The idea was intoxicating. I knew I should probably stay home, be responsible, but the thought of another night watching Steven work made my skin crawl. In our bedroom, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Where was the fun, vibrant Luna I used to be? I missed her. I missed feeling desired, feeling important. The party suddenly felt like more than just a night out. It was a lifeline, a chance to remember who I was before mortgages and motherhood consumed my identity. I stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at me. The witch costume hugged my curves in ways my usual mom uniform never did. I ran my hands down my sides, feeling a mix of excitement and guilt. This wasn't me. Or was it? The old Luna, before kids and mortgages, would have rocked this outfit without a second thought. As I applied my dark lipstick, Lisa's words echoed in my head. "You deserve this, Luna, you deserve to feel alive again." She was right. When was the last time Steven had even looked at me like I was desirable? I pushed down the nagging voice of doubt and grabbed my purse. One night, that's all I was asking for. One night to remember who I used to be. The party was in full swing when I arrived. The bass thumped through my chest as I made my way inside. Lisa squeezed my arm and shouted, "You look hot," before disappearing into the crowd. I felt exposed without her by my side, but as I made my way to the bar, I noticed heads turning. A guy in a vampire costume gave me an appreciative once over. Another winked as he passed by. The bartender slid me a bright orange cocktail. "Compliments of the gentleman in the pirate costume," he said with a nod. I turned to see a good-looking guy raise his glass in my direction. My cheeks flushed as I smiled back. When was the last time a man had bought me a drink? Hell, when was the last time Steven and I had even gone out together? As the night went on, the drinks kept flowing. My inhibitions lowered with each sip. I found myself on the dance floor, moving in ways I hadn't in years. Men gravitated towards me, their hands occasionally brushing against my hips or back. Part of me knew I should feel guilty, but a larger part was reveling in the attention, soaking up every compliment and lingering glance. For the first time in ages, I felt seen, desired, alive. I stood there, swaying to the music, my witch costume hugging my curves in ways that made me feel both excited and guilty. The party was in full swing, and I could feel the eyes of several men on me. It was intoxicating being noticed like this again. That's when I saw him, a tall, rugged guy dressed as a pirate. Our eyes met across the room, and he flashed me a charming smile that made my heart skip a beat. He started making his way towards me, weaving through the crowd with confident ease. "Ahoy there, beautiful witch," he said, his voice deep and playful. "I'm Brad, can I get you a drink?" I nodded, trying to ignore the little thrill that ran through me at his attention. We chatted as we sipped our drinks, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. Brad was funny, charming, and he made me feel like I was the only woman in the room. As we talked, I couldn't help but notice how fit he was. His pirate costume showed off his toned arms, and I caught myself staring more than once. He must have noticed too, because his hand started to linger on my arm when he laughed at my jokes. The music changed to something slower, more sensual. Brad held out his hand. "Care to dance?" I hesitated for a moment, thinking of Steven at home. But then I remembered how distant he'd been lately, always buried in his work. I deserved to have some fun, right? It was just dancing. I took Brad's hand and let him lead me to the dance floor. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close. I could feel the heat of his body through our costumes, and my breath caught in my throat. We swayed to the music, our bodies moving in sync. Brad's hand slid down to the small of my back, and I felt a jolt of electricity at his touch. I looked up at him, meeting his intense gaze. Before I knew what was happening, his lips were on mine. The kiss was heated, passionate, nothing like the perfunctory peck Steven and I exchange these days. I melted into it, savoring the thrill of being desired again. When we finally broke apart, I felt dizzy. Part of me knew I should feel guilty, but another part, a louder part, was elated. It was just a kiss, after all. What Steven didn't know wouldn't hurt him, and hadn't he been emotionally absent for months now? As the night wore on, the drinks kept flowing, and my inhibitions lowered. I found myself creating more of that intoxicating attention. That's when I noticed two guys dressed as superheroes eyeing me from across the room. They approached me, introducing themselves as Jacob and Eric. Jacob was tall and muscular, his superhero costume emphasizing his physique. Eric was leaner but just as attractive, with a charm that immediately put me at ease. "You must be the most beautiful witch at this party," Jacob said, his eyes roaming over my costume appreciatively. Eric chimed in, "We couldn't help but notice you from across the room. Care to join us for a drink?" I knew I should say no. I'd already kissed Brad, and that was more than enough excitement for one night, but the way they looked at me, like I was the most desirable woman in the room, was irresistible. We got drinks and found a quieter corner to chat. Their compliments were constant, making me feel more alive than I had in years. Jacob's hand would occasionally brush against my arm, while Eric's eyes never left mine as he spoke. The conversation grew more flirtatious, and I found myself responding in kind. It was like I was watching myself from outside my body, surprised at my own boldness. "You know," Jacob said, leaning in close, "there is a room upstairs, if you'd like to continue this conversation somewhere more intimate." I knew what he was implying. A small voice in my head screamed at me to stop, to go home to Steven and our kids. But the louder voice, fueled by alcohol and a desperate need for attention, urged me on. "Lead the way," I heard myself say. As we climbed the stairs, my heart raced with a mix of excitement and shame. This wasn't about love or connection, it was about feeling wanted, something I hadn't experienced in so long. The room was dimly lit, with a large bed dominating the space. As soon as the door closed behind us, Jacob pulled me into a passionate kiss. Eric moved behind me, his hands sliding down my sides. I lost myself in the sensation of their hands and lips. It was a blur of pleasure and guilt, excitement and shame. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but in that moment I couldn't bring myself to care. As things escalated, a small part of me wondered how I'd explain this to Steven if he ever found out. But that thought was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming need to feel desired, to recapture the vibrant woman I used to be before the responsibilities of adulthood took over. In that room with Jacob and Eric, I wasn't Luna the mom or Luna the wife. I was just Luna, wanted, desired, alive, and for those stolen moments, that was all that mattered. I woke up in Lisa's guest room, my head pounding like a jackhammer. Fragments of the previous night flashed through my mind, each memory hitting me like a punch to the gut. The pirate costume, the dancing, the private room upstairs. Oh God, what had I done? I sat up slowly, fighting off a wave of nausea. My witch costume lay crumpled on the floor, a stark reminder of my reckless behavior. I couldn't bear to look at it. As the fog cleared from my brain, guilt started creeping in, but along with it came a surge of defiance. Why should I feel guilty? Steven had been emotionally absent for months, maybe even years. He was more married to his job and that damn mortgage than he was to me. I thought about our house, the one we'd dreamed of together. It was supposed to be our sanctuary, our happy place. Instead, it had become my prison, trapping me in a life that felt increasingly hollow. I tried to convince myself that last night was just a mistake, a moment of weakness. No one needed to know. No harm done, right? But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Still, I couldn't bring myself to feel as remorseful as I probably should have. The attention, the desire I'd felt last night, it had been intoxicating. For the first time in ages, I'd felt alive, wanted, seen. I reached for my phone, dreading what I might find. A missed call from Steven, a text asking when I'd be home. My stomach churned. How could I face him after what I'd done? I walked through the front door, still groggy, my whole body feeling drained from the night before. The house was quiet, too quiet. Stephen was sitting at the kitchen table, the same spot he always stationed himself at when he drowned in his work. His laptop illuminated his face, his eyes flitting between cells in his spreadsheet like they were the only thing that mattered. When he glanced up, it was quick, a flicker of recognition, but nothing more than a tired hey, no questions about where I'd been. No acknowledgement that I hadn't even come home last night. Just back to work without a second thought. I stood there for a beat, waiting for more, maybe hoping he'd ask how the party was, or wonder if I even had fun, but he didn't. The silence in the room pulled heavy between us. It was like I wasn't even there. My stomach twisted, invisible, a ghost in my own home. I looked down at my shoes, feeling the weight of my coat hanging off my shoulders. The witch costume was shoved in some bag in Lisa's car, and I wondered if he even noticed what I'd worn or if it would even matter to him if he did. Probably not. He'd probably just nod, too wrapped in the numbers on his screen to care. It felt like there was a wall between us, something thick and impenetrable, and it hadn't just been built overnight. That thing's foundation had been laid months ago, maybe years. Every check Stephen deposited into that bank account, every time he worked late, every time he came home too tired, all bricks stacked one by one, sealing me off from him. I went to the fridge, pretending like I had a purpose being there, trying to fill the silence with some noise, but it still felt like I was wading through molasses in this house. Sure, I had made mistakes, huge ones, but I couldn't stop myself from thinking. Stephen drove me to it. When was the last time he'd really looked at me, really paid attention? When was the last time we'd touched? I could pick a month, maybe 2 or 3. I couldn't remember exactly when it all stopped. We'd become more like these walking, breathing figures in the same house rather than a couple. It was just about money now, the mortgage, his job, everything except us. I glanced over at him again, but he hadn't moved. Same exact spot, same workmanlike expression carved into his face. I couldn't take it anymore. "I'll be upstairs," I muttered, though I doubted he even noticed. I didn't hear any response. The thing was, I knew I should feel more remorse about what had happened at the party. And I did. There was sickness in the pit of my stomach any time I replayed flashes of it all in my head. But there was another part of me that felt validated, wanted, like all the staring eyes and compliments and touches in that dim, pulsing room made me remember a version of myself I thought had died, that young, carefree Luna who didn't spend nights alone while her husband buried his face in work. I barely recognized who I'd become at home. What was Stephen doing? Grinding away at our future, at this house that sat just a little too heavy on us. He didn't feel me anymore. I'd been cheated emotionally for longer than I'd even admit to my closest friends. I trudged upstairs, peeling the sweaty, thumping memories from my mind, but it wasn't long before I started feeling off. The discomfort started subtly, just a little itch here and there. At first, I brushed it off. I mean, it was probably nothing, right? I convinced myself it was something stupid, like my body rebelling against the cheap costume fabric from the night before. But the next day, after lunch, I couldn't deny it. The burning had intensified more than just itching. I went into the bathroom and just stared at myself in the mirror, trying to do that stupid thing where if you avoid reality long enough, it'll somehow bend to your will. The mirror offered no comfort. I felt something churn in my gut, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Because as the symptoms worsened, I couldn't deny what might really be happening. I didn't want to even think about it, but it was all I could do. No amount of convincing myself this wasn't happening made it stop. So I did what anyone would do in this situation in the modern age. I grabbed my phone and started Googling herpes. The word hung there on the screen, sharp and cutting. My stomach dropped and a cold sweat washed over me. All those articles and support forums scrolled past my eyes, the symptoms matching up uncomfortably well with what I was feeling. Panic coiled in the pit of my stomach. What had I done to myself? I sat down on the edge of the tub, staring blankly at the phone in my hands. I felt my pulse quicken like my body couldn't get enough air in fast enough. A thick, gnawing guilt crawled up my throat. If this was real, if this was really happening, I'd have more to deal with than Stephen's indifference. What if I had passed this to him? I replayed the last time we'd been together intimately. It had been so long, too long, but still not long enough ago for the anxiety to simmer out. I closed my eyes and that familiar wave of shame lurched inside me. What had I done? I sat in the doctor's office, my heart pounding in my chest. The sterile white walls seemed to close in on me as I waited for the results. When the doctor finally walked in, his face was serious. I knew before he even opened his mouth. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson, but the test came back positive for genital herpes." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the air leave my lungs as the reality of what I'd done crashed down on me. The doctor kept talking, explaining treatment options and management strategies, but his voice faded into a dull buzz in my ears. All I could think about was that night. The excitement, the thrill of feeling wanted again. Now it all seemed so hollow, so stupid. I'd thrown away my marriage for a moment of passion. And this was my punishment, a lifelong reminder of my betrayal. How could I tell Stephen? The thought made me feel sick. We'd been distant lately, sure, but he didn't deserve this. He'd been working so hard for our family, and I'd repaid him by bringing this into our lives. I left the doctor's office in a daze, barely registering the sympathetic looks from the receptionist. The drive home was a blur. I kept seeing Stephen's face in my mind, imagining his reaction when I told him. Would he be angry? Devastated? Would he leave me? At home, I avoided Stephen as much as possible. Every time he touched me, I flinched away, making up excuses. I have a headache, I'm just really tired, work stress, But I could see the doubt growing in his eyes, the confusion turning to suspicion. He'd ask me what was wrong, and I'd brush it off. But I could tell he wasn't buying it anymore. One night, as we sat at opposite ends of the couch, the tension thick between us, Stephen finally broke. "Luna, what's going on? You've been acting strange for days. Did something happen?" I froze, my heart racing. This was my chance to come clean, to tell him everything. But as I looked at him, saw the concern in his eyes, I couldn't do it. I couldn't bear to see that concern turn to disgust, to hatred. "It's nothing," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just been feeling a bit under the weather lately. I'm sure it'll pass." Stephen didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it. The guilt gnawed at me, threatening to consume me whole. How long could I keep this secret? How long before it destroyed us completely? It didn't take long. One evening, I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest as Stephen's eyes bore into me. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I could feel the weight of my secrets crushing me. I scrolled mindlessly through my phone, trying to act normal, but I knew the facade was crumbling. "What's going on with you? You've been acting weird for weeks," Stephen said, his voice cutting through the silence. I froze, panic surging through me. My mind raced, searching for an excuse, anything to deflect his suspicion. "I'm just stressed about the kids and the house," I mumbled, not meeting his gaze. But Stephen wasn't buying it. He set his laptop aside and leaned forward, his brows furrowed. "Luna, don't lie to me. Something's off, and I want to know what it is." I felt trapped, cornered by his questions and my own guilt. My hands shook as I put my phone down, finally looking up at him. The concern in his eyes only made me feel worse. I don't know what you want me to say," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Stephen's frustration was palpable now. He stood up, pacing the room. "I want you to tell me the truth. We barely talk anymore. You avoid being intimate with me, and you're always on edge. What happened?" So his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, threatening to spill over. The weight of my secrets was becoming unbearable. "Stephen, I started, my voice cracking. I made a mistake." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression a mix of confusion and dread. "What kind of mistake?" I took a deep breath, knowing that once I spoke the words, there was no going back. "At the Halloween party," I said, my voice barely audible, I cheated on you." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as Stephen's face transformed from shock to disbelief to disgust. He stumbled back, as if physically struck by my words. "You," what he whispered, his voice hoarse. Tears were flowing freely now, and I couldn't stop the words from tumbling out. "I'm so sorry, Stephen. I was drunk, and I felt lonely. And, God, I'm so sorry." Stephen's face had turned to stone, his eyes cold and distant. How could you do this to us, to our family? I couldn't bear to look at him anymore. I stared at the floor, my shoulders shaking with silent sobs. There's more, I choked out. More. Stephen's voice was flat, emotionless. I nodded, feeling like I was about to be sick. I contracted herpes. The room fell silent again, the weight of my confession hanging in the air between us. I dared to look up at Stephen, and what I saw broke my heart. His face was a mask of pain and betrayal, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. I heard his footsteps echoing through the house, then the sound of the front door opening and closing. I sat there alone in the silence, my world crumbling around me. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. When I finally heard Stephen's footsteps returning, my heart leapt into my throat. He appeared in the doorway, his face set in a cold, hard expression. When he spoke, his words were like ice. We're done. You've ruined everything. I stared at Stephen's back as he walked out of our bedroom, his shoulders tense and rigid. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to him, to beg him to stay and talk, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say to fix this? Days turned into weeks, and Stephen became a ghost in our own home. He'd leave for work before I woke up and return long after I'd gone to bed. When our paths did cross, he'd avert his eyes, his jaw clenched tight. The few words we exchanged were clipped and cold, strictly about practical matters, the kids, bills, the house. God, the house. Our dream home that we'd worked so hard for now felt like a mausoleum. Every room held memories of happier times, now tainted by my betrayal. The kitchen where we used to dance while making dinner was silent. The living room where we'd cuddle and watch movies was now Stephen's makeshift office, piled high with work he brought home to avoid me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I knocked on the guest room door where Stephen had been sleeping. Can we talk? I asked softly. There's nothing to talk about, he replied, his voice muffled through the door. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood. Please, Stephen, I know I messed up, but we can't go on like this. The door swung open suddenly, and I stumbled back. Stephen stood there, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. What do you want me to say, Luna? That I forgive you, that it's all okay. His words hit me like a physical blow. No, I just thought maybe we could. Could what? He spat. Pretend you didn't fuck two strangers at a party. Pretend you didn't give me a lifelong STD. His voice cracked on the last word, and I saw the pain and betrayal written all over his face. I felt like I was drowning in guilt. I'm so sorry, Stephen. I never meant to hurt you like this. He laughed bitterly. Well, congratulations. You succeeded spectacularly with that. He slammed the door in my face. I slid down the wall, hugging my knees to my chest as silent sobs racked my body. What had I done? One night of selfish indulgence had destroyed everything we'd built together. The next few weeks were a blur of shame and regret. I'd wake up each morning hoping it had all been a terrible nightmare, only to be confronted with the cold reality of our situation. Stephen threw himself into his work with a vengeance, picking up extra shifts and staying late at the office. I knew he was doing it to avoid me, and I couldn't blame him. Our home, once filled with laughter and love, now felt like a prison. The mortgage payments loomed over us, a constant reminder of the future we'd planned together, a future I'd shattered with my reckless actions. I tried to keep things normal for the kids, but they sensed the tension. Why doesn't Daddy eat dinner with us anymore? Our youngest asked one night. I choked back tears as I made up some excuse about work being busy. The guilt was suffocating. Every time I looked at Stephen, all I saw was disappointment and disgust. He had been working so hard to support our family, to keep up with the mortgage payments, while I had thrown it all away for what? A few hours of feeling desired. And then there was the herpes, a permanent reminder of my infidelity etched into both our bodies. I couldn't even imagine how Stephen must feel knowing he'd have to deal with this for the rest of his life because of my selfish actions. As the days dragged on, the reality of our situation became clearer. Our marriage was over. Stephen had completely shut me out, and I knew there was no coming back from this. The only thing holding us together now was the house and the kids, but even that felt like it was hanging by a thread. I found myself lying awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd gotten here. How had I gone from a happily married mother to this? A cheater, a liar, someone who had destroyed her family for one night of excitement. The weight of my actions pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I had ruined everything, our marriage, our family, our future, and for what? A moment of feeling alive again? It all seemed so trivial now, so incredibly stupid. I knew it was only a matter of time before we officially parted ways. The end was inevitable. All that remained was the painful process of figuring out what came next. How would we tell the kids? What would happen to the house? How would we manage financially? As I lay there in the dark, alone with my thoughts and regrets, I realized that this was my new reality. This was the consequence of my actions, and I would have to live with it for the rest of my life. The guilt, the shame, the knowledge that I had thrown away everything for one reckless night, it would always be there, a constant reminder of what I had lost.